It strikes me that, in a way, you're generally, across the board, offering a kind of critique, not of nature poetry, but really of the tradition, the American imagination's perspective on nature. Going back, I should begin with the appearance of the first Europeans on the horizon. A view of nature as this kind of screen onto which they could project all their desires, religious desires, imperial desires, capitalist desires, etc. And out of that grew a tradition of poetry which is peculiar to the Americas, and we call it nature poetry. And I see it in most contemporary American poetry today, whether it's African American or Anglo American or Asian American or Latino American, it doesn't matter, male or female. A critique, really, of that tradition and of that role of nature in the American imagination. And I welcome it, for one. I mean, I think it's a valuable critique, and I don't think it's peculiar to any particular ethnic, racial, or gender background.
Can I add? I was just thinking about how growing up, and I think that this might, I mean, it's interesting to think of like ideas that we have about each other and ourselves, but I remember growing up in California, we would go to the beach and spend time on the beach, and my parents would both take us out hiking or to the mountains, and there was this spoken and unspoken understanding that Black people don't like to be in the woods, or Black people don't like to do this kind of, like, be a person. And I hear that among many people, this kind of imagination of what Blackness is and what appreciation that I grew up with, and even though it was everything told me that wasn't true, the way that my family raised us told us that wasn't true, but there was this kind of idea. And then I think about the way that we're taught to read poems or read writers, the work of writers. There's the kind of the disconnection, the erasure of a connection to the landscape, to the land, to one's own history, which is steeped, obviously, all of us in land and water and X, Y, Z. And I just think, I mean, realizing, okay, everyone is relating to earth, to nature, to place. And it's just how that blind spot, it's almost like you have to kind of insist on opening up and entering the poem or the work, realizing that, reteaching how to think and read writers of color, which I think is, I mean, there's something very, it's a kind of taking land away again. You know what I mean? By how we're reading or not reading, you don't have to read how to read.
But what's really fraught in that discussion is the idea that, you know, like Russell was just saying, there is that critique that's been happening across the board. It's not that white writers write about nature more than we do, or Latino writers write about it less. Exactly. But there is something being said as there are silences about all sorts of things happening in our world, right? And this is one way in which that silence is manifesting itself, in that there's an artistic world that has suggested to us, in the same way that we walk out in the world and it's suggested to us that Black people don't do X, Y, Z, Black people don't go camping, Black people don't go hiking, you know, that sort of thing, that eventually we also buy too. Right? We buy particular monoliths about our experience if it's told to us enough. And hence, we come up here and we're like, we're also not sure we write about nature either. when we go back and like, I've been talking about this shit the whole time. I know we've been kind of just like batting back and forth, dominating the conversation. Any more questions or additions from here?
Yeah. It seems to me that, including the mouse poem, I have not heard a poem read tonight that I would describe in Russell's terms as a nature poem.
Good.
Yeah.
Because that's a derogatory definition.
Yeah.
You said that it's the way that we're taught to read Black poets, but it's the way that we're taught to read poetry at all. I can't think of a good poem that I love that I would not describe in the broader sense as a nature poem, because that's what poets do. is they are getting into the nature of things. And like I say, you're reading urban poetry, you're reading whatever, but what's not natural about the urban environment? It's like around 3,000 years.
What Michael Harper was trying to say that afternoon.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I'm having a little trouble with this definition of what a nature poem is, because I, like Natalie, hated what I thought was nature poetry when I was going through school, because it didn't seem to me that it was getting at anything real. And it wasn't until later that I discovered that poetry was, in fact, a real thing and a part of life, as opposed to some artificial thing that was put on a page that was only read, what was not meant to be read. You know, a poetry reading when I was coming up was somebody going out on the head, three little days together, you know, like this, and nobody reacting to it, nobody go, oh yeah, nobody reacting to what was going on. Today's poetry scene is so much different from that, where audiences actually get into it. You've been here, you've read here to audiences that responded, even though it's the country, in an almost urban way, where they were into what you were doing, and they were not politely going like this or anything like that. They were deeply into what you were saying. And I think there's a really major change in the way that our society is relating to poetry. It's now out there as like, I don't believe that any one of you would say you're embarrassed to say to somebody on the street that you're a poet. But I can tell you, in the 60s and 70s and stuff, it was somewhat intimidating. You know, like if somebody said, well, okay, you're applying for this job. What was the last job you had? Well, I was a poet, man. You know, you wouldn't say that.